Kote Nogin.
Mhm.
Welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate you having me.
So we'll dive right in. Kote Nogin is a current student at HBS, but more importantly, you had a storied career just before HBS since 2016, in fact, in serving in the U.S. Army. What was it like what is the life of a soldier in the U.S. Army like?
I mean, I would say it's an incredible experience throughout. In my past 7 years, it's taught me a lot of valuable skills, teamwork, leadership, perseverance, and it also gives you at a very young age an incredible opportunity to see so many different things. Like myself, I got to go, from Afghanistan to Whitehall in the UK to, Slovenia. It's just a really varied experience and really gives you kind of a taste of the world, I would say.
Now, what are some of the roles that you kind of had an opportunity to work on over 7 years? It's a long time.
Yeah. So over the past 7 years, my main kind of job has always been intelligence analyst, even if, I kind of what I did within that was a bit different. So my first 3 years in the Army, I was kind of in a typical intelligence analyst role, which was supporting an infantry unit. So what that is really you're trying to predict what the enemy or adversary is going to do, and you advise the commander on basically what they should do or whether we should task certain assets to figure out what they're going to do. So it's really just kind of like it's almost like a game of chess. You're trying to predict kind of what's going to happen next. And we do that through a variety of means through kind of our more specialized intel collectors. Now, during that time, I also had the privilege of deploying to Afghanistan for 9 months. In there, I really kind of had three main roles. The first one was I was in charge of all the interpreters on our base. I'm a native Russian speaker, so I kind of wanted that role. Working with all of our Afghan linguists, it was really amazing. Kind of what first of all, just the willingness to work with us and kind of put almost their lives on the line, without actually being in the military. And I even still keep in touch with a few of them. Aside from that, targeting and advising. So with targeting I specifically was basically working on fulfilling what the commander needed in our area of operations and figuring out what assets, what methods we need to use to fulfill those objectives, whether it's through, area denial or other means. That one was a lot of fun, a lot of critical thinking, a lot of problem solving. And then the last one was advising. I think that was the most worthwhile one. I worked directly with the head of counterterrorism for the Nangarhar province National Directorate of Security. So I advised him basically on, their how they were employing their human assets, how they were conducting their counterterrorism operations. It was really amazing.
During this 9 months in Afghanistan.
Yes.
It must have been an incredibly challenging, I'm sure, and definitely, no doubt, unique experience. What, speaking to as much as you can speak, what would be, for our audience, what would be a typical day be for you if, during your deployment?
Yeah, so I would say probably, wake up nice and early. We work typically, 12 to 16 hours. And then I would go into, I guess what you could call an office, it's more of like a makeshift, building, but I would go in, I would basically check on the night's, reporting, see what's going on in our AO, and then really get in touch with our partners, see if there's anything, that they're dealing with that we can help with. And then basically start working on, whatever targeting kind of requirements that we have for the day. Then typically a bit later, I would have to gear up and get ready to fly to one of our partner bases. So we called it Fly to Advise. So we would basically load up a few Blackhawks or Chinooks, mostly Blackhawks, and fly to our partner base, let's say in the city of Jalalabad, where I would meet with kind of my counterpart over in the National Director of Security, kind of their version of the FBI at the time. And we would discuss, basically their requirements, areas in which we can help them maybe improve their processes, or, help with certain intelligence sharing. And then I'd fly back, draft up a report of the meeting, work a bit more on targeting, and then get in touch with my Terps. That's typically a nice day. Sometimes, if I'm lucky, my interpreters would go out into the city and they'd bring us back some, like pizza or some authentic Afghan food, which I would say was like light years better than anything that they served on base. I still miss it, but yeah, that's really a typical day for me.
Well, speaking of food and the military, there was a meme going around a while back that, was like a mobile Burger King, I believe, being shipped off from like a large, cargo plane. Mm-hmm. What are the food options available on base, would you say?
So I guess if we're talking downrange, I guess the options, they varied by the size of the base. So when you went to a really large base like Boardroom or Kandahar or even Kabul, you would find a Burger King, you would find Pizza Hut, mm-hmm. or it's not really what you'd expect in the States, though. Much more limited options, know. But you'd find pretty nice kind of food from home, or at least fast food from home. There's coffee shops, mm-hmm. And then there's what we would call the DFAC. That's where we are served kind of like a standard set of food. That's typically it's shipped in. It's all meant to last a very long time, but it's all right. It gets you through the day. Now, when you get to a base my size, we have the DFAC, and that's about it. If we're lucky, we work with some of kind of the more special elements on the base, and to get a grill and some charcoal, and mm-hmm. if maybe once a month we could get some frozen steaks shipped in. And then there's the last one is kind of your combat outpost, or really it's just you have MREs. That's the only choice you got over there. But I would say in all three of them, if you know the right people, you can get some Afghan food, and that's by far the best option out there.
Yeah. We'll dive a little bit more into Afghanistan, certainly. And you were there, I believe, in 2018 through 2019. And, that was a few years before the fall of Kabul and the fall of Afghanistan, or back to the Taliban. What was your sense of the situation back when you were there?
So to be entirely frank, I think, in 2018 when I was there, everybody already could tell that this wasn't going to end in any sort of positive way. I think there's a lot of factors that kind of led to that. I think, the U.S. did not have an appetite to really commit more resources. And, at the end of the day, you didn't need more resources if you wanted a positive outcome. I won't get into whether, that more resources was the right thing, but we didn't have it. And I think the larger issue was that, we were trying to bring our kind of American brand of democracy to a country that really, I don't think, truly understood it, mm-hmm. or wanted it. I think when we worked with a lot of our Afghan counterparts, you'd give them supplies, mm-hmm. and those supplies would go straight to the Taliban, because there was a lot of relationships, right? Like the Taliban, it was somebody's brother that was in the army. Their brother was in the Taliban, and so it was, I think, a situation that just could not be won the way that we were doing it. And I think everybody knew. But I would say on the one positive side, mm-hmm. and I think a mentor of mine really said this to me, which was, the situation might have been doomed, but every year that we were there was a year that, a girl could go to school, that children still had a better chance at a future, and a better chance at an education. And I think that in and of itself, was worthwhile.
Certainly, at least for a generation, over, nearly 2 decades or so, at the very least. Did you have any, friends who, during your time you made, the locals that, you feel that you've kept in contact with, or did you, were many people able to, from who you knew, able to leave Afghanistan, or many had to choose to stay?
Yeah, I think from the people that I kept in touch with, luckily they are all now in America. Mm-hmm. One of my buddies is a proud Texan,
Very nice.
And I even had the privilege while I was over there. One of my interpreters, I helped him kind of through the process for citizenship. We went to
Wow.
the embassy in Kabul together, and I helped him get through all of that. And it's really a worthwhile experience, because like my family are a family of immigrants as well, that came to America to escape oppression, and seeing that American dream, further realized in people after me, and being able to play a part in that is pretty amazing. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to keep in touch with my counterparts that I advised in the NDS, but I hope that you know um, everything worked out for them as well.
Yeah. I want to dive into, speaking of background, a little bit about, you've served for 6+ years, but I want to dive into your background a little bit and specifically what drove you to serve, and specifically as an enlisted soldier. So, versus somebody who is an officer in the U.S. Army who had to have a college education to join. You joined straight from high school.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yes, and I guess I'll start with answering kind of my motivation to join, and then more into the enlisted side. So I'm a first generation American. I'm really proud of that. My family, both of my parents came from the Soviet Union. So my mom from Kiev in Ukraine, and my dad from Georgia.
Mhm.
And I mean, they came to America for a better life. That's why they were here,
Right.
and they were able to give it to me. I grew up just south of Boston, and I had a much better upbringing than they did. Now, unfortunately, life happens to everybody, and I ended up growing up with a single mom. It was just me, my brother, and her, and we didn't have as much as I would have wanted growing up, and it was tough. I was working full time while I was in high school. Every day I would get off school, and then I would go straight to work, until pretty late at night, midnight, 1 a.m., and then start the next day. And it kind of impacted my academic trajectory. I got into college, and I remember thinking, I can't afford any of this. And I started kind of looking at options of what will really help me get to where I would want to be. What will help me get the skills that I need, the life experience, the job experience, while also helping set me up, in the long term. And that's when I really stumbled upon the U.S. Army. I initially, before I really looked into it, my family's impression of the military was what the Red Army was, which was not a good place to be.
Right.
So my family wasn't too supportive. But when I really saw what the U.S. Army stood for, and kind of in those same values that brought us to America, I decided that that's definitely the path for me. And it didn't take long for me to make that decision. And at 18, I enlisted. And I would say when I was looking at what job I wanted to do, I knew I wanted something that, would challenge me, that would give me a lot of critical thinking, a lot of experience with diverse problem sets. And that's why I chose being an intel analyst. Now, talking about, the enlisted experience versus the officer, I would say it's incredibly different. It's night and day. Obviously, officers, they have college degrees. They and what they really are administrators. While the enlisted are the workhorse, they're the workers of the military. For enlisted, what you do is you're there to learn a specific job, to fulfill a certain function, and to continue doing that, and eventually lead soldiers under you in doing that. The officers are really there for, in a garrison environment, to do the paperwork, to make sure the unit functions correctly, that, the enlisted are able to train, become proficient at their tasks. What you see is officers typically don't spend more than 18 months doing kind of whatever they're supposed to specialize in. So like in intelligence, an officer will typically only lead, an MI, platoon or company for a very short span of time before they kind of go into a more generalized role. While enlisted, it's all the way you're working. And I think that it instills a lot of great values in you, teamwork, leadership, and just perseverance. But I would say I wouldn't trade it for the world.
Well, that sounds definitely like a very great experience that you had, and very formulative. I think, in the 21st century, now it's 2024, we've seen in the United States kind of a drop of interest steadily over time in young people, especially serving in the U.S. military, from World War II to now, I think we're at among the lowest rates and interest and also faith in the institution. And I believe even last year, the Army has had a lot of trouble recruiting to fill the necessary quotas, right, to maintain the readiness that the military requires. Why do you think that is?
I think that's a very complex problem, but I'd say if I was to kind of come up with a few, one, the abilities of our current generation, the views of our current generation, and then the Army's kind of inability to really adapt with the time. And the first one I'll kind of get into is our current abilities. There's actually a study out there that the bone density of like our generation, it's less than previous generations.
Interesting.
It is. It's literally because
we are literally getting weaker.
Yeah, like at least out of our generation that's entering the Army, because this is an Army study, right, or military study. But the bone density, it's literally weaker, so it's harder to keep up with the stringent kind of physical requirements of the military. That is something that they're struggling with because, when they look at, their trouble to recruit, they first need to look at like what pool can they recruit from, and that pool itself is getting a bit smaller.
Right. And
then there's, kind of more the views of the modern person. So a big one right now is marijuana consumption, right? It's legal in more than half of the states now, but in the military, you will get kicked out if you test positive for marijuana even once, right? And like for the more specialized roles, like for instance, in the cyber command, it's really difficult to recruit people that need to, stay away from all of these things that they enjoy. And then there's also kind of just the views on the U.S. military. I think our withdrawal from Afghanistan definitely wasn't done in a manner conducive to public opinion. I think that, a lot of these conflicts that we got into, Iraq and Afghanistan, fighting in wars very far away that didn't really necessarily have a big impact on the U.S. people. I think it's difficult. It's a lot easier, in World War II when the threat's at your doorstep to want to fight for that. And I think that, you need to motivate people, or not you need to motivate people, but people need to be more motivated to want to risk their lives in such a way. And I think that it's just, to a lot of people, it's not worth it. But I personally, as somebody that's been in the military, would never have traded that experience for anything else, with everything that I've gone through.
Yeah.
And I believe that it's worthwhile for people to join. It really teaches you, a sense of civic duty. It teaches you, self-reliance, independence, and hard work, perseverance. I can go on. I think that it's something that is really valuable.
Certainly. Yeah. Do you think that, what do you think the U.S. military could do or should do in order to potentially reverse, or at the very least, kind of at least not further decline on kind of this recruitment trend and, getting the talent needed for the U.S. to maintain its readiness?
Yeah, I think they need to look at kind of what is the role of the average soldier and really redefine it through modern times. Do we need to have the same incredibly strict standards for all support personnel? Mm-hmm. That because these same standards that we have for the infantry are applied to, a cook, right? And I do believe that, everybody should be ready. Everybody should be trained in the military. But at the same time, if we believe that, it's very hard to meet our quota, right? For how many people we need in the military. So I think there needs to be some give and take. And I honestly don't know in what areas that give needs to be in, but there does need to be some give. And I also think that, we need to work on rebuilding trust as a government overall with the American people. I think that, especially in the past decade, we've seen a lot of polarization. We've seen a lot of, just a lot of craziness, right? And I think that no matter where you land on that, I think that what it does is it erodes trust in the institution of the government, no matter who's in charge. And I think that also has a very drastic effect. So if we change that, I think it will also affect how many people are willing to kind of come into the military.
Definitely. Speaking of trust, I wanted to ask you about your experience, in the latter half of your career, specifically working for NATO. For Americans, often, NATO is this faraway entity. It's back during the previous administration, there was we wouldn't fund NATO or we would pull out potentially, and so tell us about briefly your experience working in NATO, right? And as much as you can talk about it, and kind of what your thoughts are on that institution in the 21st century.
Yeah, I'm incredibly grateful for my experience in NATO. I want to say it has been the highlight of my military career, of my life. Really, it was incredibly fulfilling. Now, my job in NATO for the first almost year, I was just working kind of in a logistical fashion, where I was just making sure stuff was running in my specific organization, and it was just a lot of kind of back office work, but I worked hard and applied for a special position where I essentially formed, developed, and maintained relationships with our allies throughout NATO. Mm-hmm. So, and it's looking at, potential synergies between NATO and those countries' ministries of defense, mm-hmm. Potentially helping them build up their own capabilities. How can we all, work together? And potentially increasing those countries' contributions to NATO specifically. And what I saw kind of throughout my experience is NATO is an incredible force for good. I think that in the 21st century, we really see that NATO is just kind of America and then everybody else. And I know a lot of people think that. And I think in some ways it's true. It's the fact that America's there kind of gives a lot of countries, especially in Western Europe, almost a sense of ease. Hey, America's going to help us out. Yeah. But you can see, and you saw that in kind of lower amounts of military spending and such. But I think in Eastern Europe specifically, I loved working with our Eastern European partners and Baltic, Eastern Europe and the Balkans, mm-hmm. because they were motivated, they were ready, they wanted to improve their military capabilities to make sure that they're safe, that their people are safe, because to them the threat was real. Even before the invasion of Ukraine, it was real, and even now. And I think that NATO itself has been an amazing force for that. Now, one thing that I thought was interesting when I came in was when I was first in my role, I really wanted to kind of take America out of all of the discussions that I had with people. I wanted to be purely NATO. Whenever we came to an ally, we're like, hey, America's just another partner. Yeah. But what I realized was a lot of our allies actually enjoyed having America kind of on top. Interesting. And you'll see this a lot because America was almost like this neutral arbiter for disagreements, for local disagreements. Like this is in no way based on an actual scenario. This is just like a make-believe, hypothetical. Yeah. Like Croatia mm-hmm. would rather America has the final say in something than, let's say, Slovenia, one of their neighbors that they potentially have a dispute with. So America being across the sea, across the ocean, it was actually, they found that helpful.
More neutral arbitrator. Yeah.
And I thought that was really interesting. But NATO is such a powerful force for good. It's a deterrent. It's there to help bring all of us together, increase interoperability, increase our mutual defense. And
With NATO itself and your experience in the U.S. military, you've, of course, had an opportunity to engage with personnel from a lot of European nations. Can you talk a little bit about the culture with the military from what you've seen with, European military service members versus here?
The culture. So I guess the way in Europe they look at their militaries is it's almost just another job. I feel like I thought it was interesting, in America, we're very much about supporting our veterans, supporting our troops. In Europe, it was almost like that's your 9 to 5 as opposed to somebody else's. And
interesting.
So there wasn't as much like kind of, I would say, prestige in it as we see, but which I think maybe kind of affects, how small their militaries are. But I would say that the more Eastern you go, the more focus there is on military. I really enjoyed working with our partners in Poland because in Poland, I mean, you can see throughout their history and what it is today that to them, their national defense is incredibly important because they haven't necessarily been in a position to defend themselves in the past, and to keep themselves independent. So I think it's interesting seeing that contrast between the U.S. and Europe in terms of how we prioritize our military, and then what our military kind of thinks about.
Definitely. And, now in the last 2 years, we've had more expansion of NATO with the Scandinavian countries, several joining. Do you foresee the role of NATO still playing a vital role of security and stability in Europe in the 21st century?
I do. I think NATO. I think it's great that we have more countries ascending into NATO. I had the privilege of working with our Finnish and Swedish partners, before they ascended, and they were all really motivated. And I think it's important, to have that collective defense. Russia might be getting exhausted in Ukraine now, but it's important to look 10, 20, 30 years in the future and ensure that we have the capabilities now and then to be able to defend ourselves. And I think that's incredibly important for NATO. And I think it also fosters a lot of really positive dialogue within NATO member states as well. It increases, I think through every NATO exercise where our militaries are working together, building these bonds, where our governments are working together and building these bonds, I think that is incredibly important as well, because, whereas in the past, a regional conflict could get a lot bigger, now it can be resolved amicably because there's so many lines of communication, relationships that are vital to all of that. So I think NATO is still an incredibly important organization moving forward.
Absolutely. And, as you mentioned Russia briefly, right, and the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, where we have a U.S. election coming up. There's, we've given Ukraine tens, if not, I believe, maybe over 100 billion, but at least in the tens of billions of dollars in military aid and other supplies and propping up their economy. But in the United States, you see increased attitudes among a significant portion of the population towards isolationism and skepticism on the need to send so much of our resources as Americans, our taxpayer dollars, overseas to support these conflicts. And in the next election, it may very well result in a changing of our stances there. What are your thoughts on kind of that American attitude, towards foreign policy and aid in the 21st century?
So I'll start off by saying when I was younger, I was very much pro-isolationism. I was like, why are we, out in the world? We should be focusing on ourselves. And, having seen the world, traveling a good chunk of it, having seen kind of how the system works, I think it's incredibly important that America is involved, overseas beyond our own borders, because our system depends on kind of that global space. It's not... we're not a completely self-sustaining, country. Right. We have our global supply lines. We have our global security, while nothing can threaten our borders today, if we let things fall apart elsewhere, they can in the future, right. And I think that our tendency towards isolationism is one that can be unhealthy. It might not directly, affect us today, but 10 years down the line, 20 years down the line, it could be a very different story. Right. And I think the case in Ukraine it's a really interesting one because, people are very much against, hey, we're sending billions of dollars to Ukraine. But before the invasion, right, Russia was basically our number one threat, right? They were our near peer military today. And at the cost of no U.S. lives and about 3% of our defense budget, by just sending weapons to Ukraine, helping their own self-defense, we have taken our number one adversary and incredibly negatively affected their military capabilities, right, to the point where they likely can't even threaten, further into Europe, right, much rather America. And I think that is probably one of the best investments that the Biden administration has made in during their time. We've brought them down, right? And right. I think that it's important to realize that we're all interconnected. Our partners in Europe, are where we get our raw materials, and let's say in Asia and in Africa, it's just by focusing only on ourselves and neglecting everything else, it's going to affect our economy. It's going to affect our quality of life here at home, and I think people should remember that.
Absolutely. Well, I want to bring us back home a little bit and more closer to here at Harvard. You've served 7+ years in the U.S. military, and you joined straight from high school at 18. You did a college degree also in between in there as well. Why did you choose to come do an MBA at Harvard?
Yeah, so I loved my military experience, but at the same time, I never like really saw myself doing a full career in the military. I was passionate about what I did as an individual contributor and as like almost like a middle manager, if you will, as a non-commissioned officer. But I did not see myself kind of climbing the ladder, so to speak. And really, I thought to myself, what do I want to do and how do I accomplish it? That was kind of my thoughts. And what I wanted to do was I wanted to pivot my career into the business world, but still kind of do a lot of the stuff that I enjoyed doing in the military, which was, critical thinking, solving unique problems, working in diverse teams of just like with talented individuals that are all smarter than me so I can learn from them. And when I thought about that, I was like, an MBA is a really great way for veterans to pivot into the civilian world and do work like that. And you actually see like there's almost a pipeline into MBA programs because it's easy because an MBA program isn't highly technical. To get into, I don't know, med school is a bit more tough if you don't have that background. But an MBA program, they accept a much more diverse kind of variety of applicants. And so I was like, an MBA is right for me. I started looking at schools and, obviously HBS is one that has amazing academics, amazing students, amazing people. And
Absolutely.
it spoke to me. And then not to mention I'm from Boston, so I got to come back home, which is always a plus.
Absolutely. Well, you also mentioned that, a lot of veterans come to HBS. There is a solid pipeline, as well as to any business program. But what's something more unique about you is that you joined as an enlisted after a career in the Army as an enlisted soldier, where the much bigger proportion of the veterans that come to business school tend to be officers. Why do you feel there is that slight contrast?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the first one is, officers already have a college degree. Officers have, a lot of leadership experience, which a lot of MBA programs, prioritize. But I would say aside from that, there's a lot of talented enlisted individuals out there that have achieved their bachelor's degrees while in the military. And I think that, a big one is just self-selecting out, is not believing that you can apply and make it into such a program. And I think some of it, I remember when I was going through the process, there's a lot of resources out there for veterans that want to go into MBA programs, but about 95% of them are all geared towards officers. The materials are for officers, the mentors know how to mentor officers, other officers. And, it's very daunting. And I remember I spoke to one enlisted veteran that was in a top MBA program. And he even told me, if you're not special forces or like a pilot, your chances are slim to none. And I could see how like hearing that, from everybody that you speak to can be difficult. For me personally, it just made me want to apply harder, because I was like, I'll prove them wrong. But I feel like there is a niche. Schools value the diversity of perspectives. I know even in the HBS kind of admissions team, they mentioned like there's not enough enlisted applying. Like that was the big thing. Like there wasn't enough qualified enlisted applying. It wasn't that, they were rejecting everybody. And I think it's important to get the word out there and create resources. And I'll give a little plug here. There's a great resource for enlisted veterans that want to apply to MBA programs. It's called Enlisted Exfil. You can find us on LinkedIn. We have a whole Discord for different schools and pairing with mentors. And I think it's a really valuable program that I wish I knew about when I was applying, but it exists now.
That you found out after.
Yeah.
Wow. So yeah, I mean, sometimes it's just the resources being visible for people to know, right? If you, as immigrants, people don't necessarily know all the resources that if you versus somebody who's had a multi-generational family here in the United States, certainly. Your HBX experience, how does it feel to translate? How well does your military experience translate to your learning experience on campus?
The entirety of the HBS experience. I mean, it's been great. I feel like at first it was kind of not an awkward transition, but like one that was almost uncomfortable, because going from a very strict kind of regimented life to really choosing your own adventure, you can, aside from having to show up to class, all the extra activities that are happening afterwards, you kind of got to figure out for yourself. And there's just such a variety of things to do. It was almost difficult. I feel like in the military, you have a very set path that you're able to follow. But I mean, it's been amazing. And I think there's a lot of transferable skills for veterans kind of at HBS. One was, we have a class on leadership, lead. And I think it's, at least in my section, the vets love that one, because we're able to apply a lot of the experience we went through to kind of these situations that we're going through. And I would say that the military also really helps you become more adaptable. I think this is an unfamiliar situation, an unfamiliar place. We're kind of moving from across the world, like me from Belgium to here. And I think that adaptability that the military teaches you is definitely helpful in kind of getting settled in and becoming part of a very different community than what we're used to.
Yeah, absolutely. Now that we're a quarter of the way through the program, I know this is a bit far in the future, but you mentioned that, you're not going to go back into the military. You did your career in the military for 7 years. What do you hope to transition to specifically, after HBS?
Yeah, I feel like I still have not fully, committed to any one kind of path. I like to think of what I want to do in terms of long-term goals. Where do I want to be in 10 years? And really, I think I want to have an impact. I want to have a job that, keeps me on my toes every single day. It's where, and I want to also have a lot of agency kind of both in my personal and professional life, and by agency, I mean, like, you're not tied to the desk and, worried about every email. Like, I think that it's important to be able to balance those things. I have an amazing wife, Sandy, that I also want to prioritize. And I think that's kind of what I think about for my long-term goals. So when I think about what do I want to do in the short term, I really think either management consulting, which for a lot of vets is a great avenue to really learn about the business world, explore a lot of different industries, really find your niche, coming out of the military. Or the other one is entrepreneurship through acquisition or
search funds. You're buying a business.
Yeah, I think veterans are overrepresented in search funds. About 25% of HBS searchers have been veterans.
Wow.
As opposed to the 5% of HBS that are veterans. And I think it's because veterans have a lot of, solid skills. Working with blue collar workers is a big one. Being able to navigate managing large teams. I think in the military specifically, there's a lot more experience coming into HBS with that. There's a lot of officers have managed 200 soldiers, and it helps translate to, running a HVAC business or acquiring a software company. So I think those two avenues are really kind of the ones I'm looking at right now.
Do you feel that the academic experience has been for you a kind of a challenging experience because of kind of like the different professional experience beforehand in the military, or do you feel that is like kind of the biggest thing for you in terms of like the value you might derive from HBS?
Yeah, I think that it hasn't been as bad as I thought it would be transitioning into this academic environment. I think that we have like world-class professors. We have amazing classmates. And I think the case method really helps vets kind of dive right into this academic environment, because you need to share your perspectives, your opinions, rather than, just taking a test, writing an essay. And I think that makes it a lot easier to kind of transition into that. And I will say, so I was a finance major for my undergrad, and I took a plethora of finance classes, and I will say that just in Fin 1, I feel like it was a lot of the topics that we learned in Fin 1 were pretty similar to what I learned in my finance undergrad. But I would say that Fin 1 teaches it with so much clarity that one, HBS class compared to almost my entire major was almost equivalent. Like it was night and day. I feel like we also, have a professor that's like world renowned in the field. So I think that also helps. I think it's great.
Just one last question, for our audience we'll dive into before the end of our podcast. But, you mentioned you want to have an impact. You're trying to figure out your path. What does success look like to you? Not now, not just after graduation, but, you're young, but maybe in like 20 to 25 years when you're at the height of your career. What do you feel to you would be that success?
I feel like for me, that would be being able to either acquire or start a business, scale it, and create something that's sustainable, that has a positive social and material impact, both in terms of kind of the impacts that it does, something that helps the community, for instance, creates jobs, helps take care of people, being able to give back, using these opportunities that I've been given, obviously the privilege that I have of being at HBS and receiving this education. So just being able to create that big impact, being able to also be involved in my personal life, my wife, Sandy, and hopefully, our many children, but being able to also be there in their lives, and honestly, 20 to 30 years, hopefully being involved in the public sector. I feel like in the public space, I feel like using these opportunities that I have, this privilege that I have, I want to give back to the community. I want to be able to, give the same experiences that I had to more people, being able to give the same opportunities to more people. And I see the public office as a potential avenue for that.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Kote, for sharing your story, your experiences, and your insights with myself and our listeners.
No, thank you very much for having me. It's been great. And I'm really glad I had this opportunity to talk about all of this with you.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Cool.